Right. Yeah. So welcome again to the Startup Network's expansion to the U.S. with our friends at the U.S. Commercial Service. In just a moment, I'm going to hand over to our friends at the U.S. Commercial Service, but really just a big, pleasure and very grateful to partner with these folks as they know exactly what you're going to need to know to expand over to the very large market in the United States. And speaking of the United States, I don't know if you can tell by my accent, but I am American. I came here 2 years ago as my wife decided to not force me, but gently nudged me in the direction of moving to Australia. She is an Australian citizen and from Taiwan originally. And so it's a big pleasure. And actually last yesterday, I got my permanent residency here in Australia. So the joys of moving to a new country and fulfilling a dream are always great, but also it can be scary and you have a lot of questions. And so today, for instance, here's a great way to maybe expand your business to the US and have some of those questions for people that really do know the ins and outs of the business. There's a plethora of that we're going to go over. A couple key points that I like is maybe some customized resources on different industry sectors in the US that they're going to talk to us about, but really just an open-ended conversation. So whatever questions that you have, like I said, just put them into the chat. We'll get on to all of them, and yeah, let's kick this off. I'd like to introduce our friends over at the U.S. Commercial Service. I believe we're going to start off with Steve, who's our the regional commercial officer. Steve, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ryan. And like you, I'm also an American in Australia and loving it. And I am the head of the operation here, the U.S. Commercial Service um, office. I'm based in Sydney, and I actually have regional oversight of what we do in Australia, in New Zealand, and also the Pacific Island countries. So we do actually have resources around the region. And just very quickly, the U.S. Commercial Service does trade and investment promotion. And my colleagues are going to talk to you a little bit about a very specific program we have called Select USA, which is the program that we utilize to help Australian companies to try and set up shop and build operations in the U.S. But the context is important too, right? So we really have a terrific trade and investment relationship between our two countries. Trade is, we have a free trade agreement. Australia U.S. free trade agreement was penned almost 20 years ago, 2005. And trade in both directions, two-way trade has increased by 138% since then, up at about $77 billion. And we like to trade with each other, which is terrific in all sorts of sectors. And it really runs the gamut. So whether it's IT, whether it's healthcare, whether it's defense, whether it's clean tech, we really have a very robust trade relationship and investment too, right? So we invest in each other. By far, the U.S. and U.S. companies are the largest source of FDI investment in Australia, hiring about 320,000 Australians. And then lots of Australian companies investing in the US too. So actually, Australia is the ninth largest source of FDI investment, foreign direct investment, in the United States. 100,000 Americans are working for Australian companies. So you add those two together, it's, closing in on about 500,000 people employed by companies on either side. And that's growing too. So we've got about $1.7 billion Aussie investment in terms of the U.S. Australia investment relationship. So whether it's trade or whether it's investment, we are working very, very well together. And so with that, I'm just going to hand it over to my colleague Duncan, and then you're going to hear some case study here on what it's like to go from Australia to the United States. and open up, but we are your resource. So take it away, Duncan, to tell our audience a little bit more about exactly how we can help. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thanks very much, Steve, for that intro. Welcome everybody to this event today. I want to thank Ryan from us to Ryan and the network of putting this information session together. Really, this is we're thrilled to be able to do it, and we're thrilled to have so many folks on the line. So really, let's consider this a sort of a lunch and learn, if you will. No question is too silly to ask about setting up in America. So the way we'd like to structure this, I'll just give a little bit of introduction around Select USA, who we are and what we do, what the aim is in terms of helping Aussie companies who are looking at the US market. We're then going to move into a sort of a fireside chat with one of the companies that we've assisted pending AI, and David Cardoza, who's really going to share his experience around the desire to get to the States, what he's actually done, the company that he is. And then we're going to follow that up once we've had that discussion with my colleague, Georgie Harrowell, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the other Select USA programming that we do, which is essentially to take a delegation to a summit, which occurs in DC in the middle of June. So as Steve was mentioning before, Select USA is part of the US Department of Commerce, and our role, both Georgie and my role here, is to assist Australian companies who are looking at setting up in the US. So at the simple end of the scale, we're Australians working for the US government, and our whole role is, if you have a company either now or down the track that is looking to set up in the US and kind of importantly to hire US citizens, from a federal US government perspective, we want to assist you to do that. We are distinct from Austrade and Victorian government or New South Wales government, indeed any of the state-based governments, in a couple of areas that I'd probably like to get to. So just very, very quickly, in terms of the sort of services we offer, the first is market research. So essentially, on behalf of Australian companies, if you're interested in the market, but you're thinking, gee, we know we want to go, we're committed, but we know it's also a very big market. I mean, you've got 50 states and you're thinking, where the hell do we go and start this whole process? We can provide market research that is generated by our colleagues in headquarters in DC, which would essentially on your behalf pass down 50 states and territories to saying, based on the requirements of your company and the sort of data that you need to make an informed decision about where you would want to go and set up, we can provide you some analysis that pass down those states to, say, 4 or 5 jurisdictions that we think you should go and speak to. So that information may be completely new to you. It might be information that you haven't gotten. You go, well, that's great. And for other companies, they may have already done that sort of analysis. So it really is a kind of a third-party validation of the sort of analysis that you've already done. The good news is for you guys is that market research is all free. As a federal government based entity, we really don't care where you go as long as you go to the US. So, you know, we don't have a preference to California over to Texas to Colorado. It's all the same for us. We just want you to get there. The second part of the analysis, so as I mentioned, it's free, and both Georgie and I will provide our contact details. So if you're at that point of your journey where you think that sort of information would be useful, we'd be very happy to have that conversation with you. The second part is based on the back of the market analysis that we do. We make introductions to those economic development officers in those jurisdictions. So each state in the US would have their EDO, their Economic Development Office, which has a mandate put on it by their governors to go and create employment in their areas. So they are uber keen to have a conversation with any foreign company that is considering setting up in their jurisdiction. The other good news is they have a competitive tension with all the other states. So you can happily say, I'm speaking to New York, I'm speaking to Louisiana, and I'm speaking to Colorado. They really don't care because they want to pitch themselves as the best place for you to go and set up. They're also the ones at a micro level that can give you information on any tax incentives that might be relevant to your industry. They may be able to provide you with information more granular on tech hubs that they may have in their jurisdictions that might be a useful sort of home base for you to set up that whole US expansion. They also perhaps have got more granular information on some of the end users that might be relevant as well. So we think that that's a compelling reason to speak to these EDOs, these economic development officers, and they are an excellent resource for any Australian company if you're at that part of the journey where you're thinking, we just need to speak to people to give us some guidance on where we're going to set up. We can also provide introductions at the federal government level in the US to perhaps speed up the sort of the time to get responses from any other federal government agency that may be germane in your quest to do business in the US. The last part, which I'm going to let Georgie talk about a little bit later after we've done our fireside chat with David, is each year we run what we call the Select USA Summit, which is a 3-day love fest around everything to do with setting up in the US. We recruit an Australian delegation. We would love to have you involved in that. Last year, we took 45 Australian companies across to the summit. It's essentially a 3-day event with plenary sessions, anything to do with how to set up in the US. And on the running at the same time, all of those EDOs we were talking about have sort of trade show style booths that you can go around and speak to all the different EDOs under one roof, which is a pretty amazing experience. So I'm going to let Georgie sort of run a sort of a micro lens over that one for you a bit later, and I can't wait for that as well. Two matters at hand, and while we're here, and I think that this is so good, would just like to thank David Cardoza for being involved. I'd like to introduce David and Pending AI. Pending AI is it provides and develops AI solutions for scientists in the pharmaceutical industry to design, make, and test novel drugs to treat diseases. We originally spoke to David about doing some market research in November of 2024, and happily we were able to say that David he hasn't mucked around, and the company is already set up in the US, and we're thrilled to have David on the call today to talk really around his company, what they're doing in the US, some of the pitfalls, the roadmap to setting up an operation, and we feel that this will give you firsthand feel for a small to medium-sized Australian company that's looking at it. Just before we get to David as well, I'd just like to say as well, in terms of the Select USA program, we don't care what your size is. It's not as if we have to be speaking to companies that are have 300 employees. We really want to speak to anyone that is keen on the US market. So I just want to make that point quite clear. So if we get to David as well, I'll just read a little bit of his bio and then bring him into the discussion as well. So David Cardoza is a medical science by training, having undertaken a research doctorate at the University of Sydney and Children's Medical Research Institute, investigating the development of novel drug candidates for epilepsy. Following graduation, he shifted focus towards the business world, holding project management and commercialization positions with the medical research ecosystem, all while studying an MBA. He is currently the VP Business Development Strategy at Pending AI, drug discovery platform enabled by artificial intelligence and quantum mechanics, where David is responsible for initiating and scaling US operations, as well as performing legal, business development, commercial, and scientific strategy and funding acquisition, which means grants and investment functions globally. So he's got the full gamut of of responsibilities. And I'd just like to welcome David to the chat, if you're there, David.
Yeah, good, Duncan. Thank you for the introduction.
Great to have you on the call. So, David, do you want to just sort of start by telling us a little bit? I know I've read out your bio, but just tell us a little bit about yourself and pending AI, and then perhaps we can start to flesh out, why the US was such an attractive market for you.
Yeah, certainly. So, as Duncan mentioned, Pending AI is essentially a drug discovery platform operating predominantly in the pharmaceutical industry, where we're leveraging a suite of different artificial intelligence and quantum mechanics-based capabilities. And I guess I just want to echo Duncan's earlier point around the size of company. So I imagine a lot of the people here on the call will be from earlier stage ventures and startups. And so that's very much what Pending AI is. So we're a team of 9 FTEs in total. So there's myself based here in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the US. We've got one of our scientists based in Berlin, Germany, but the bulk of the team is split between Sydney, Australia, and Melbourne as well. So we've been backed by venture capital. So Main Sequence, which is a deep tech firm, did back us about 4 or so years ago. But then I come here and then
I'll get you
tell.
that. I'm just going to send you the email to have a once over before we send the guys.
Sorry. So apologies for the interruption. But yes, so yeah, we've been backed by venture capital. So Main Sequence filled our seed round about 4 years ago. We've undertaken a little bit of a change in our fundamental business model. So the company itself was bootstrapped on the provision of one of our capabilities as a software license. So that kind of allowed us to develop the company, build the team over time, and and means that we haven't necessarily had to take on another round of venture capital since. But where we're moving is towards the development of our own drugs. And so being in the pharmaceutical industry, that's quite a capital intensive endeavor. So I'll probably just leave the introduction there. I think Duncan did a really good job of introducing myself, drug discovery scientist by training, and then developed business skill sets afterwards. So kind of it's the perfect role for me at Pending AI. Essentially, I'm the first business dedicated recruit for the company. And as many startup founders and early stage entrepreneurs will appreciate, you wear a lot of hats in the company. You can't afford to be specialized, especially in those very early days. So hence why I'm involved in essentially everything business facing in the company. So hopefully that provides a good overview, Duncan. Oh, sorry, you're on mute, Duncan.
Sorry about that. Thanks, David. That was an excellent intro by you. I mean, we could go in so many different directions. If we just start with, you were talking about funding. So then if we look at Main Sequence, are they giving you is there a, like I said, we can look at, how do you attract capital? That's a whole sort of day of discussion just in itself. But a Main Sequence sort of stipulating where they think that you should be looking at in terms of markets, foreign markets. I'm just sort of trying to get to this thing of, why the US then? I mean, Europe has a sort of a fairly strong pharmaceuticals market as far as I'm aware as well.
Yeah.
Is it driven by your investors to go there, or how does that all pan out?
It's a good point. So happy to touch on that journey and provide greater context. So for us, like the move to the US is unanimous. Like we're very well aligned in terms of our existing investors and the company itself, because for us, like we are ultimately a deep tech company. We're in the pharmaceutical development industry, and so it's quite a capital intensive and long drawn process to be able to develop a drug from kind of day zero where we operate through to the patients in the clinic. And so we found it quite difficult, just in all candor, to develop a company such as ours, which is a platform-based proposition, which can go after a range of different disease states. That we found that ultimately Australia didn't necessarily have the critical mass, like in and of itself, with regards to pharmaceutical company presence, to venture capital presence, that's highly specialized in our field. There are a suite and there are a range of different venture capital firms in Australia that do a phenomenal job, but as it relates to pharmaceuticals and whatnot, we felt that the capital requirements over time for us would necessitate that we would need to seek that capital outside Australia and establish a presence in jurisdictions, like you mentioned, like Europe and the US, that have access to pharmaceutical companies. So kind of taking it from first principles, it's almost, we took a very scientific approach to this. We said, look, like we recognize that, we do need to expand into different markets. And so we did a little bit of background research and sort of identified, Singapore, Europe, and like the UK and Germany in particular, and the United States as some core jurisdictions to explore expanding into. And so I was fortunate enough to kind of had the opportunity to, to travel to these ecosystems last year. So embed myself in the ecosystems for, 2 to 3 weeks at a time. And I found the most useful exercise was to actually just speak with other entrepreneurs that are in a similar space and understand, that are, sort of 1 or 2 steps ahead of me, and really understand kind of what their capital requirements were, what their journeys were. They've kind of been there and done that. So I had a lot of those conversations. And I found that speaking to those entrepreneurs and those leaders, that it was almost as though moving to the US and trying to list on the NASDAQ or seeking an acquisition in the US was almost an inevitability. That even when speaking to large European pharmaceutical companies, there were still like startups, but they were in the 100 to 200 employee phase, that they were finding themselves having to flip up their parent entity into the US to try and list on the NASDAQ to attract the relevant capital to push them into clinical trials and ultimately push their drug candidates towards the clinic. And so for us, like we were hearing this over and over again, and we just found like it's like it was almost an inevitability that a lot of these larger companies even had to do this. And so kind of the longer you leave that process, the more complicated and the more expensive it gets to flip your parent entity to become a US company. And so for us, being an early stage venture, we're like, if it's going to be an inevitability, why, move to Europe and set up a headquarters in Europe, knowing full well in 3 to 4 years, we're going to have to move it to the US anyway. For us, it was just like, let's just go direct to the source. So yeah, that was kind of what informed the thinking. And it was really around, almost like taking it to first principles and just doing some customer discovery and speaking to people that have, trodden that path before and getting those insights. So that's kind of what led us broadly to the US. And then I'm happy to go into a little bit like of more granular detail as to where in the US made most sense for us. So once we decided that the US was the place to be. Again, we did a little bit of research, and this is something that I'm happy to go into later. But the team at Select USA really helped with doing a lot of market research. We did find that the Massachusetts, California, New York, and Washington D.C. were the most appropriate, I guess, states for our company and our industry. And so again, had an opportunity with stakeholders on the ground. And what ultimately led to the move to the Massachusetts area and Boston and Cambridge in particular for us was just what we noted was just the intense amount of concentration of venture capital, of pharmaceutical company decision makers that were in the Kendall Square and Cambridge area, that we felt that no other state or city could really replicate it. So hopefully that provides a little bit of context for us. And, like I guess another thing to mention as well is that I always saw US expansion as kind of this big item that it's like, oh, we raise a huge round from venture capitalists and then we will set up our presence in the US. But then over time, we started to just question that thinking, that we felt, like, why don't we just have a very low touch approach to US expansion? It allows us to, have someone on the ground. It allows us to have someone to build those relationships and demonstrate commitment to the market, because that's another thing that's really important to investors and partners, that you're in that ecosystem for the long haul. So in Pending AI's perspective, I guess we're, somewhat unique because I haven't seen other companies do this, but we essentially just relocated one person in the first instance. to just set up the base. And then now we're looking for venture capital in the US to help expand the team and expand our presence from there. So that was a very long-winded answer, Duncan, but hopefully that provides some degree of insight.
No, well, and thanks, David. It gets like this because there are so many moving parts to it. So, like if we start at the top of that, you're talking about, talking to founders who have done it before. I know it's pretty basic. So, but how do you do that networking? What does that look like? Does it look like that you go on an Austrade sort of event, or you speaking to groups like this, or are you just sort of trying to LinkedIn people? I'm just curious how you would have done it, because everyone's got a different approach, and some people might find it a little bit sort of daunting to sort of insert themselves in that world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So like the answer is it's a mixture of approaches. So attending business partnering conferences like Bio, for example, in San Diego this year. You mentioned the Select USA Trade Forum will be another fantastic opportunity. But what was really, I guess, interesting to me was just being able to attend those events and just, pull the string of the network. That it's like the person you talk to might be a VP at that company, but they may not have been involved in that journey of scaling the company, but they can certainly introduce you to a founder or a C-suite executive that was involved in that journey. So I did find myself just attending a lot of business partnering meetings, understanding, looking at venture capitalists' websites in certain countries and looking at their portfolio companies. Also reaching out on LinkedIn just for pieces of advice, but just I guess like having not had an existing network and an existing ecosystem, I just found the most important thing was just to continue to keep trying and just keep pulling on that thread until you get to someone who has had that lived experience. And so I leveraged a whole range of like my existing network to connect me to people wherever appropriate, but yeah, business partnering conferences and LinkedIn as well. And I found that a lot of entrepreneurs see that you're kind of going through a similar struggle to them, but and I think that they're quite open with their time, because if they feel that a 30-minute conversation with you can save you a week's or 2 weeks worth of research, I think as a general trend, I found that entrepreneurs tend to be quite giving and were quite open to just being candid with you as well and just providing you their own insights and feedback.
It reinforces the strength as well of the power of attending these sort of trade shows and events, doesn't it? Right? Like just taking a biz dev trip and going to a trade show in the States and speaking to as many people as you can. I think that's right. Just as well, do you think that, notwithstanding you're in, a sort of a technology industry based on the kind of med tech world, in my view, it still doesn't hurt to speak to anyone who's done it. It doesn't really matter what sector, because there'll be some issues that are common across multiple sectors. Is that your feeling as well?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, like I guess I can only provide the healthcare, medtech, pharma perspective because that's my background. But invariably, starting and building, scaling a startup company has common challenges, but it also has unique challenges as well that I wouldn't necessarily be across. But I think just one thing to note here as well, it might be a good opportunity to flag it, is that I do feel like it's important to have these conversations and to map these longer term strategies out as soon as possible, like as in as early in your journey as possible, because it does take quite a long time to be able to familiarize yourself with a completely different ecosystem where on a whole different, whole bunch of different levels. Like I guess there's, even the operational level where employment laws are different, your tax laws are different, your filing laws might be different. So having an understanding and meeting with the relevant stakeholders, but even from a startup standpoint, having an understanding of where your journey is going and having the conversations to set you up for success such that you're not necessarily leaving it to the last stage. So I would just encourage, other entrepreneurs, whatever industry you're in, to just, make sure you start those conversations early and gain that familiarity early.
let's just dive in a bit.
Mm.
We always advise, with business development in the States, not to sort of tackle the whole thing at once. Like, don't think of the US as just one big market, but rather take small steps. What's your experience been like, over there?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It really only took me to, travel to each of the states to just recognize how different. It might as well be 50 different countries, let alone states. And I do think that there's a lot of, especially in biz dev and partnerships, like a lot of it does come down to relationship building. And so, not necessarily even just taking on the US market as one monolith, but I also found that, like I had the approach that, I could live in Australia and just do my job and it'll be fine. I can fly, push these things along. But like I guess, yeah, it's important to note that, yeah, relationship building is a fundamental, part of building partnerships, getting investment, and all of these sorts of things, and being embedded in the relevant ecosystem, at least initially, that provides that value and allows you to develop those relationships, I do think is really important. So that level of focus is critical, especially in the sort of initial early stages of international expansion. Of course, once you get like your Series C and your Series D, yeah, knock yourself out, set up multiple offices in the US. But in these very early stages, yeah, like focus really does matter. Otherwise, you stretch yourself far too thin.
Right, and being able to honor the commitments that you're making in, for whatever client it is, being careful that you're not overstretching yourself on something and not being able to deliver on a certain project. I think is probably pretty critical to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
We touched a little bit. So just to give everyone a little bit of some background, I originally met David probably in the middle of last year. I cannot remember where the contact came, but David reached out to us understanding the sort of work that we did in terms of providing the market research. And around, I'm going to say November last year, we provided David with some market intel. We called it a locations and resources report. And it pretty much did what we were talking about before, which was passing down a huge list of states and territories to a smaller group based on what David was looking for, which was sort of some key indicators in his sector. Amazingly, since November, David's set up there. And David, you've been there now for, I'm going to say 2 months. Would that be about it?
That's correct. Yep.
So, for us, it very, from getting research to putting boots on the ground, it is quite remarkable in terms of the time frame. But outside of the work that we've done, what other resources have you sort of lent on in terms of any state-based initiatives from Australia's perspective, or did you find any other sort of groups useful in this whole process?
Yeah, certainly. So, just to echo your thoughts around the market research, I did find that process was, tremendously useful because, as was mentioned earlier, it's essentially a free service. And from my side, I just had to think around sort of a laundry list of questions that I wanted to ask about the US market, and they were very vague. Very I guess differentiated. So everything from what was, the relevant role, and how much do they typically get paid in these 3 or 4 different ecosystems, asking things around, the changing legal landscape with respect to AI. Like, it was just like, it was all over the place, but it was just like essentially a laundry list of questions. And I had, I had absolutely I was under no illusion that they would all be answered, but I was actually quite surprised that they will be able to provide quite in-depth market research on this whole range of different topics. So, so I would encourage.
We have some good researchers, David.
Yeah, yeah, that's for sure. So I was certainly surprised in a good way. So would definitely encourage people to take advantage of that resource. And then so with respect to other other organizations, I think like speaking to government organizations on both sides is really important. So was connected with the Austrade people. quite early on as well. And, they were helping, business development efforts, like I guess globally. But once we kind of made that decision that the US was really for us, they allowed us to, they facilitated, on the ground introductions to personnel that they had, for example, within the Boston ecosystem. And they also have landing pads across the US that, you can visit and have office space there. But then on a state level, like I think, because we were based in Sydney, New South Wales, and so Investment New South Wales was quite helpful. But one thing that I didn't necessarily appreciate until I got into the nitty gritty was just how large the US is, just even within the context of one state. So when we talked to Massachusetts, we had the state, so there was a federal level with, the team, like Duncan and the team. Then you've got the state level, which was, the Massachusetts Investment and Trade. And then you've even got it on a city level, where,
Right.
as you were saying earlier around tax incentives, like the city of Boston, the city of Cambridge, city of Somerville, they've got their own economic development teams. And it's just like, and they're only, 150,000, 200,000 people, like on a population level within each of these cities. So it's like the economic development, it's just so large that it necessitates this, tiered approach. And so having conversations with even on a city level was quite phenomenal. And what that allowed us to do is that a lot of these organizations, work in close concert with one another. And so even though I didn't have a presence in Massachusetts at that time, the International Trade Organization made introductions to state-based organizations that help Massachusetts, based companies. And so understanding their tax incentives, understanding their programs, and they were happy to just jump on the call, even though I didn't have a presence in Massachusetts. They were just like, yeah, they're happy to just, even the fact that you're exploring us, happy to spend the time and provide these overviews. And so, when I ultimately relocated there, I just reached out to people I had conversations with, a couple of months prior, and was like, hey, I'm here on the ground now. Do you want to catch up for coffee? And they're like, oh, fantastic! Like, they were super happy and really over the moon. So. So I think talking to government organizations on both sides is tremendously important in that process.
And they're happy to have a chat, aren't they? They're not. It's not as if it's too difficult to get their ear. They're there. They've been chartered by their governors to bring in employment, and it's what they're there to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing as well that I find absolutely tremendous about the US is just like, I guess you spoke to this earlier, Duncan, around that competitive advantage between states and how they essentially compete with one another. And it's just like, even that in and of itself is very like entrepreneurial. So it resonates quite well. So just as an example, like one of the economic development secretaries for Massachusetts is, a government employee, but in her previous life, she's, founded, scaled, and exited like 2 companies in the software space. So she's like, very dynamic person, and she's working in this government role to help enable entrepreneurship. So it's just, yeah, like it's certainly like an interesting ecosystem to be a part of.
Bit random, this question. I just want to get your sort of view on America's leadership around AI. I mean, it's growing. I've just come back from San Francisco at the RSA, a cybersecurity show, and we met with a couple of AI companies out in San Jose. We were incredible. Any comments that you've got sort of just around that sort of area and what the US is trying to do? I note that Chuck Schumer is putting together some sort of, it's not a bill, but it's really a way for AI to be sort of handled, I suppose, especially around healthcare. That certainly came up in that discussion. So I just wondered if you had any comments.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, I mean, the use of AI, it's a rapidly evolving field, both with respect to legal implications as well as healthcare implications. So, for us, it's something that we're monitoring quite closely, and and certainly there's been a lot of leadership around how to deal with our AI, responsibly, but also around economic development initiatives to facilitate the development of AI. Because yeah, as you mentioned, like California, San Francisco, Silicon Valley typically is the very, like tech and software oriented ecosystem. And so like they've got a good starting base for leadership in this space. And, on a state level, they've released economic development opportunities and funding opportunities for companies operating in the AI space. But then, coming back to my point earlier around competitive side of things, is that like Massachusetts have also, announced that, like they want to be the leaders in AI and quantum moving forward. So they're kind of already thinking, in the multi-decades, how they can introduce bills, how can they establish task forces to help enable that. And I think that that's one thing that's really quite powerful. Again, I can really only speak to the Massachusetts ecosystem, just given that I'm based there. But just how open they are to receiving feedback from entrepreneurs on the ground, that they develop these task forces, and it's truly represented across a range of different organization sizes. You've got, like your publicly listed companies right down to your early stage startups, where, like I'm starting to become involved in these types of conversations. So it's it's quite a phenomenal ecosystem to be a part of, and you really do see this this commitment towards making sure that these states are ultimately become the global leaders in AI and other advanced technologies. So I guess it'll be a matter of time to see who wins out, but yeah, we'll see.
Well, it sounds like you put yourself in the right place to actually be part of that whole discussion, which is pretty incredible. I mean, the benefits from doing that are untold. Look, we could go on all day with this discussion, and I'm mindful as well of getting some of the audience's questions and including Georgie on the conversation. If you were to put, if we were to wrap up this part of it, David, with me at least, a couple of tips for founders for the US. Is there something that you can sort of, like, just in a couple of sentences to put to the audience, to the squad assembled here, to just sort of start them on the way? Is there something?
Yeah, certainly. So it'll probably just be me, unfortunately, rehashing some points I've already made, but like I do think it's important to echo these points. So I think the first is to really explore and execute as soon as feasible. Like that, it does take time to understand the ecosystem in depth to a point where you're happy to and feel comfortable to establish a presence in the US. And it also takes time to develop meaningful relationships. So I do think that even if you feel like US expansion is 3 years away, I would start those conversations now. Like, just really make sure that you're looking at the business from the long term. So that's kind of number one. Number two, like I would just want to echo that point around being able to meet with other founders that have kind of, or early stage entrepreneurs that have kind of been there and done that, to really understand their perspective. And so, I'm happy to be a resource. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn or anything like that, and I'm happy to set up some time with anyone here on the call to discuss that further. So I do think that that's really important. And I would also just encourage as well, and this will be my final point, just to, I guess, explore low touch mechanisms associated with US expansion. So I mean, you don't need to raise, like $50 million just to set up an office in the US. Like, I do think that a lot of early stage entrepreneurs are very cash strapped. And so, being able to explore these, I guess, very minimalistic, at least in the, very initial stages of establishing a US presence is really key. And in my particular instance, it was me having relocated as an existing employee of Pending AI. So I wasn't, employed into this role. And so, and I jumped at the opportunity because I guess I'm a very entrepreneurial person myself. So being part of the ecosystem was a super exciting opportunity for me. And so if you find yourself kind of doing that, I would just quickly recommend the E3 visa for any Australian citizens because it's I think there's 10,000 spots a year, and it's like less than 40% get used. So it's like not even competitive per se, and you essentially have to fulfill, I guess, requirements around having a job in the US, being an Australian citizen, and not having immigrant intent. Like those are really the three things. And I'm like, yeah, I'm happy to fulfill those categories. So I'll just leave it at there, Duncan. Yeah, so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Terrific, David. Excellent. Great to see you again and get some of your insight on what you've been doing, because it's fantastic. And, we all look forward to seeing Pending AI and how it develops moving forward. Thank you. At this juncture of the panel, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Georgie Harrowell, who's just going to talk a little bit around our Select USA Summit and some of the benefits and some of the goodness that you may derive if you're considering looking at the US market. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Georgie.
Thanks, Duncan, and congratulations, David, again on your expansion. I mean, as Duncan said, fantastic how quickly you executed your business in Massachusetts. So just a quick overview of Select USA Investment Summit. It's coming up next month from the 23rd to the 26th of June. We're leading an Australian delegation to the summit and welcome companies of all sizes and sectors to join the program. 5 key things about the summit. There's participants, over 4,900 participants go, representation from 55 US states. So as David was pointing out, like it can be difficult to navigate the market, but having all these state representatives under one roof will save you weeks on the road. And you can set up one-on-one meetings ahead of the summit via an online matchmaking portal to talk through the different incentives, which is a really unique program. There's 16 US state and territory governors, so you'll hear from the highest levels of the states. Governors from all 5 US territories will attend for the first time, and 6 cabinet members will be attending from Commerce, State, Energy, Education, Transportation, and the Office of US Trade Representative. So again, it's supported from the highest levels of government. And you'll also hear remarks from top White House senior advisors and administration officials, including President Joe Biden. Of particular relevance to this group is the Select Tech program, which serves eligible international tech startups looking to expand within 2 to 3 years. A few benefits of participating in this program is that there's academy sessions on trade and investment trends in key subsectors, on topics ranging from smart cities to soft landing programs, in startup ecosystems and more. You have the opportunity to apply to pitch in front of a panel of judges and audiences, and delegates in the past have found it really valuable, and they receive really good feedback from the panel on how to position their business in the US. As well as those opportunities, you have the opportunity to be presented or to exhibit in the Tech Pavilion. You can participate in industry networking sessions. And again, that virtual platform for matchmaking is really beneficial. So pitching sessions are open to clean tech, health tech, ICT, software companies, and open tech. And we can share more information after the session on how to apply for those. But again, this Select Tech program helps make connections for US startups across service providers, support organizations such as accelerators and incubators, universities and research programs. And also you can get guidance on how to raise capital in the US, which is a very important topic and of great relevance to everyone on the call today. And we also have a Global Women in Tech program, so the opportunity to be mentored over a 1-year period by successful female-led businesses as well. I'm going to share a video, but I did want to add that we're building out an Australian-specific program as well. So there'll be a networking reception and opening event. So the Australian delegation really benefits both from meeting one another, sharing lessons learned with the group and the connections they make during the 3 days, to also the broader networking opportunities that the summit provides. So let me share a video that will answer all your questions likely, and then yeah, we'll go from there and pass it back to Brian.
Hi, I'm Caroline Kennedy, the U.S. Ambassador to Australia. I'm excited to announce that registration is now open to join the Australian Select USA Investment Delegation. Select USA takes place at National Harbor, Maryland. It's the most important, prestigious event promoting foreign direct investment in the United States. Led by the U.S. Commercial Service, the Australian delegation will represent the best of Australian innovation, Companies of all sizes and all industry sectors are invited to apply. At the Women in Cabinet members and governors about doing business in the United States. Whether you are seeking to set up manufacturing facilities, identify infrastructure investments, or plan for your new U.S. office, this program is for you. I hope.
So I can share that video after the call. I know it sort of cut in and out, but it's a fantastic program. We look forward to having you guys participate, and we're happy to share more information at the end. I'll now cross it to Ryan. I can see some questions in the chat. And again, thanks to David, Duncan, Steve, and Ryan for organizing.
Yeah, thanks so much, Georgina. That was awesome. And thank you so much to our speakers, David, Steve, and Duncan. It was really informative. And as an American, I got really a little bit patriotic, actually. It was very cool to hear how competitive the landscape is and how welcoming the business environment is. Not surprised. We do love money. We do love business. So yeah, let's get right into the questions, though. And please, if you have any more, just put them into the chat. We'll get it all to them right now. And then also we will, if you want to just raise your hand and speak verbally too, that's totally fine. We'll have everybody's contact information afterwards, so just in case we don't get to anything, but don't worry. Great. So let's start off with Renata has a question on sustainable packaging consulting business, which supports any organization which wants to have products in the Australian market to meet the packaging requirements, such as the Australian recycling labels and recyclability assessment. How should she expand to the U.S. market, supporting companies to come to the ANZ market and the other way around? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
I'm happy to have a first go and just admit completely upfront that this is not my domain. So I'm happy to connect afterwards and learn more about your business, and I guess provide any insight that I can. But I guess just based on what I heard, I think fundamentally it's first about identifying and making sure that you really iron out and clearly communicate what your key points of differentiation are with respect to the ANZ market. So I guess put yourself in the shoes of a US client and understand, okay, well, why should they go to the ANZ market as opposed to someone local? And I imagine that some of the I guess challenges you might face are, being able to walk down the road and inspect facilities, and then, because I guess, as I was mentioning earlier, the building those relationships on mutual trust. At least in my own experience, I found it quite difficult to navigate those relationships, kind of coming from the opposite side of the world. But I guess one core thing that I found works quite well and it resonates quite well with US stakeholders is making sure that I flag the R&D tax incentive. I'm not necessarily sure if it's relevant in your particular instance, but the idea of being able to get 43.5 cents back on every dollar spent on R&D is, actually quite powerful. Like it takes a lot of US stakeholders back. They're just like, oh, wow, so you're telling me, my dollar can go a lot further. So yeah, I do find that resonates, but happy to connect after this call and go into a deeper dive with more details.
Great. And Chassis just had a comment that, each state has its own unique ecosystem. I would totally agree, Chassis. It's completely different from, Massachusetts to California or to Louisiana. In fact, in Massachusetts, in Boston alone, I'm sure that that David can talk about, but there's certain accents in just different types of the city if you're from Revere or Charlestown or Cambridge. And so it's a complete mixing bowl of everyone and everyone together. And it's sometimes get a little bit messy, but it's a really great environment for business because of such a broad spectrum of people to expand to your customer base.
And with an Australian accent, I stick out like a sore thumb.
Yes,
everyone always goes, "Where are you from? South Africa?"
I wanted to mention this also. We Americans just simply love Australians anyway, so that's just a thing that everybody should know. You're probably our most favorite country to have visit us. So at least from my perspective. And then Lynn had a question. Thank you for sharing. I'd love to connect. Have a question. What are the pros and cons of expanding business to the USA?
Yeah, good question. So I guess the first thing that I'll say, just taking the pros first, is really being able to access and develop relationships with key decision makers for global level organizations. So that, in my particular instance, that relates to, venture capital investors, that relates to pharmaceutical companies. For example, being able to just email someone and they see that I've got a Kendall Square, location. I've been, emailing and conversing with pharmaceutical company executives that just say, "Hey, like, do you want to just pick this up over coffee? I'm just down the road." So just being able to just go and meet and access key decision makers that, I've been trying to reach for like 12 months, 18 months. It just becomes so much easier. So that's a very strong pro. And I think that one thing that it's worth being, I guess, cognizant of is that I guess within the context of the US, it is so large that pharmaceutical companies, like potential partners, potential investors, they've got so much deal flow in their backyard. They really don't need to look anywhere else. And so, like, I was really only hit with that when I went to a business partnering conference mid last year, and there was a US investor that took my meeting. And he essentially he just shook my hand and he said to me, like, I won't name names or anything, but he shook my hand and said, "You're one of 30 companies that I picked out of 800 connection requests. Tell me why you're important." And I'm like, "Oh, wow." Like, okay, so 800 people have wanted to connect. And this was a US conference. So I'm just like, that really drove home to me that from their perspective, like, I think I might have the coolest tech in the world, but just even being able to access them, they've just got so much deal flow. There's just so much going on in the US ecosystem that I guess international companies sometimes fall by the wayside. So I guess that's one pro. Another pro I'll mention. I don't know if anyone here on the call does extensive business with the East Coast of the US, but I found myself being up until 2 in the morning or back up at 4 in the morning, just have a virtual meeting with someone or a decision maker on the US East Coast. And so startups are a sprint, but they're also a marathon. So like I kind of knew, that it was a bit difficult to be able to make that sustainable. Like I just essentially wasn't sleeping. So it's suboptimal. And so I guess one of the core challenges is the reverse of that, that now I'm in the US, at the moment, for example, it's 11 p.m. at night. Being able to make sure that I can stay in sync with the team back in Australia means that, I am often working into the nights. So it is a con, but it's certainly worth doing, at least in these initial stages. That like I would just say that that's overall, like the cons certainly don't outweigh the pros. I think that the pros are much stronger. So happy to just leave my answer there.
Great, great. And then we also have a question from Maria. She has a question about trademarking. Did you engage that process before you relocated or after? And did you do it with an Australian-based firm or US-based?
Yeah, so with respect to IP more broadly, and trademarks are included in this, that you can do it with an Australian firm, and that there are mechanisms to engage international like systems. So, for example, in the specific instance of trademarks, you can file a trademark in Australia and then leverage the Madrid Convention, which is essentially like a partnership of I think it's, hundreds of companies, countries, literally, that acknowledge your Australian filing. So I do find that there's not necessarily a need with respect to IP to do that, because these sort of international mechanisms that respect IP and these treaties do exist between countries. But for everything else legal, 100% you leverage US-based firms for US matters and all of that, because it's completely different. But I think IP kind of just sits in its own separate bucket.
Great. And then Jasmine, you have your hand up. Why don't you go ahead? I think you're on mute.
Sorry.
Hold on.
Sorry, you're on mute, Jasmine.
Thank you. Thanks for unmuting me. It's so impressive to hear, Duncan, the time frame from when you decided to get there and to launch. I'm curious to know from you the cultural differences that you saw, especially when you're talking JVs, partnerships, business deals, of working with Australian people compared to the US in terms of, yeah, if you could throw some insights on the cultural understanding and how that would differ for somebody going across the world.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. So with respect to the US, like I do find that it's a very work integrated culture. So like there are, like and that operates in very stark difference to Australia. So I feel like Australia is, fantastic. Like it's a, lovely place. Absolutely love Australia. But I felt somewhat alienated being very work driven in Australia, unfortunately. Whereas I come here to the US and like every person you meet is exceptionally work driven, just, very competitive. So like it's a positive in that sense. But I guess another thing that's probably worth mentioning is just the level of risk tolerance between the two. So I think that the US is a very entrepreneurial culture. There's a lot more capital flowing around. And so I do find that being able to push forward partnership deals and things like that, given our early stage nature, is much easier to do here in the US because there is that risk tolerance. Whereas, in other ecosystems, and this isn't just specific to Australia, like other ecosystems globally, that they may see our early stage nature and go, oh, you might not be around in a year's time, like startups fail all the time. Like they have this sentiment that it's like it's a really big risk to deal with early stage companies. Whereas in the US, you just don't see that. Like everyone's just ready to just have a go. And it's like if you've got something cool and you can solve a core problem that they have, they're more than happy to explore it. So I would just flag those two as the two major differences.
Yeah,
Great, thank you.
I would agree, David. Yeah, it definitely there's a risk tolerance, especially even with funding too, with capital raising, there's going to be a little bit difference. And I wanted to mention that as well. If you're based in the US, there's a lot of, or at least that have a presence in the US, there's a lot of VC firms that will now be able to talk to you. Whereas like even some of the firms that I worked at, they don't really do international investments. It's just not a thing. So yeah, the next one we have is from our friend Pablo, and also Sam wanted to have a question about the E3 visa sponsor. So do you need to open up a local entity in the US, or can you first move with the E3 visa sponsored by the Australian entity? That'd be great if you could expand on that, David.
Yeah, of course. So the E3 visa does mean that you need to have a US presence there because it needs to be a US entity that is ultimately sponsoring that visa. So for us, like I guess there was mention of the quick time frame of relocating to the US, and that was actually quite a core stress of mine. That it's like I needed to get everything set up in the US from an entity perspective and all this sort of stuff, and then I could start my visa process. But fortunately, the E3 visa is a very quick process. Like I think typically it's a 4 to 6 week turnaround from an application to a yes or a no. But yeah, you do need a US entity to sponsor that visa. So what we did was we just incorporated a wholly owned subsidiary of the Australian entity in the US, and then we had the US entity sponsor that visa, and that was perfectly fine.
Excellent. And are you incorporated? Is there a certain state that you would advise people to choose? I know that Delaware is a very popular option. Do you guys choose Delaware, or was there any other states?
Yeah, so we have a Delaware C Corp, but then in order to operate within a particular, like have an operational presence in a particular state, you need to establish what's known as a registered office. So we have our Delaware C Corp with a registered office in Massachusetts. So we pay Massachusetts state taxes for that.
Yep. They will always get their taxes. I promise that. It looks like we don't have any. Oh wait, we have one more. Maria, any suggestion of registering a C Corp versus a LLC?
Yeah, so it really just depends on what the nature of your business is. So like I think that for services and revenue generating businesses that aren't interested in kind of going down that venture capital train, an LLC is a fantastic mechanism to leverage. So you'll see, for example, a lot of law firms or other services based businesses in the US are incorporated as LLCs. But C Corps are really necessary for being able to bring venture capital investors on board because it allows you to distribute equity in the company. So it's really just a matter of what your business is and how you want to engage with the US. and just learning what the core difference is. But for us, like given that we are in a very capital intensive business and we want venture capital, we went down the C Corp route.
Excellent. And then lastly, from Leanne, would the Select USA Summit be suitable for sustainable fashion innovation?
This is a Duncan question.
Yeah, look, it's really open to any company. It's sort of sector agnostic. Yes is the short answer. It's not going to be as a deeper dive as to going to a trade show that's sort of, relevant sort of in that sector. But in terms of the mechanics and the process of meeting people around investing in a new country, absolutely, it's the sort of thing that would be perfect.
Yeah, great. All right, well, thank you, folks. So we ran a little bit over time, but that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. Wanted to thank everybody again, especially our friends over here at the U.S. Commercial Service. And David, that was really fantastic. I hope you have a really great time in Boston, and try some lobster rolls and some New England clam chowder if you get a chance. Also, just to let everybody on the call know as well, we're going to be sending the recording out as well. So you'll have access to the recording. And if you have any questions, we'll also be sending out the contact information for the folks at the U.S. Commercial Service. Really great topic today. Really fantastic events. If you are ever interested in hosting your own events, please just reach out to us. We love to bring anything to our founders. So if it's something that can help a founder, please let us know. And then again, my name is Ryan Burns. I'm the head of community at the Startup Network. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or if you'd like to become a member. But thanks again, everybody. Have a nice day today.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.